Hi, good morning. Again, this is Francis Kaliwan, and welcome to Lessons in Financial Accounting and Reporting. Our topic for today is accounting for investment property, and our discussions are based mainly on the provisions of IAS 40 investment property. So, IAS 10 investment property shall be applied in the recognition, measurement, and disclosures of investment property, except for the following. Number one, biological assets related to agricultural activity, because these specific assets are to be accounted for using IAS 41, agriculture, and IAS 16, property, plant, and equipment. And of course, mineral rights and mineral reserves such as oil, natural gas, and similar non-regenerative resources. Okay, so how do we define now an investment property? According to the standard, investment property is a property that is a land or building or part of building or both. So technically, only land and building are to be classified as investment property. Now, question. Land and building are considered as permanent or fixed assets. Can a permanently installed equipment be classified as investment property? The answer is no. Why? Because the standard is clear. Only land and building are classified as investment property. So, hindi tayo mag-focus doon sa pagiging fixed nila. So, fixed equipment or permanently installed equipment is not an investment property. Next, held by the owner or the lessee of a right of use asset. So this is under IFRS 16, lessee of a right of use asset. In the point of view of the lessee, all leases are classified as finance lease. So si lessee dito nag-lease ng asset under a finance lease. In substance, it's an acquisition of asset on a deferred term. So, sino ang magbubook ng asset kahit inutang niya lang yung asset? Si lessee pa din. Kaya sa libro niya, debit siya dyan ng right of use asset and credit siya ng lease liability. Although there are other affected accounts now, but those are the two main accounts that we can find in the books of the lessee. Okay, so when we say right of use asset, it is an asset that represents a lessee's right to use an underlying asset for the lease term. Just to illustrate, itong lessee of right of use asset, in essence, para itong sublease na tinatawag. When we say sublease, ito yung secondary lease. May isang lessee na nag-lease ng asset in a contract of finance lease. And then, since siya ang nagbubook ng asset, tinatawag nating right of use asset, pwede niya yung iparent ulit, ipa-lease ulit, basta operating lease. Nagiging investment property yon. So, my first lease, si lessee nag-book ng right of use asset. Sa second lease, si lessee nagiging lessor. Actually, ang tawag natin doon sa kanya sa IFRS 16 is intermediate lessor. And then, mayroon tayong bagong lessee. Basta yung second lease na yun or yung sublease na yun is considered as operating lease. To illustrate, Green Cross has a right of use building. So, lessee siya. Right of use building eh. During the year, Green Cross leased out portion of the building to Sunshine Corporation under an operating lease. So in that case, si Green Cross na dating lessee, naging lessor sa sublease or sa second lease. And since yung second lease or sublease is operating lease, the building here is considered as or classified as investment property. Next, 2 or 4. So what's the purpose? Number 1, to earn rentals or for capital appreciation or both. So technically, yung investment property, ang concern dito ng owner or ng lessee of right of use asset is cash flows from rent. Kung hindi niya man pinarerentahan for capital appreciation, which is one of the purposes technically ng investment. And finally, rather than use in production or supply of goods and services, or for administrative purposes, or for sales in the ordinary course of business. Pag tinignan natin, yung first to dyan, yun yung para kay PPE. Use in production or supply of goods and services, or administrative purposes. And yung third one, sales in the ordinary course of business, yun naman yung para sa inventories. Okay? Next, define owner-occupied property. So as against investment property, what is an owner-occupied property? An owner-occupied property is a property, walang ibang sinabi. So dito, hindi lang land or building ang pwedeng i-classify as owner-occupied property. Ibang asset pa pwede. So equipment and machines can be classified as owner-occupied property. Next, held by owner or lessee of a right-of-use asset, so same lang. For, what's the purpose? Use in production or supply of goods and services for administrative purposes. So, it's as if ang tinutukoy ng owner-occupied property is PPE, property, plant, and equipment. Now, let's compare investment property and owner-occupied property. So, again, the definition of investment property and what standard will be used in accounting for investment property? IAS 41. How about owner-occupied property? What standard will be used in accounting for owner-occupied property? So, pwedeng IAS 16 or IFRS 16. Depende kung ano ang nagiging gamit sa'yo and paano mo na-recognize yung asset sa libro mo. Okay? So, that's the definition of investment property and owner-occupied property. Next. The standard gives examples of investment property para hindi tayo mahirapan sa pag-classify or sa pag-determine what are the assets that are classified as investment property. So, example number 1, land held for long-term capital appreciation rather than short-term sale in the ordinary course of business. So, it's parang against inventory. So, for long-term capital appreciation rather than sale in the normal course of business. Next, land held for currently undetermined future use. So, notice currently undetermined ang use in the future. So, pag sinabing land held as future plant site, sa future plant site siya. So, hindi yun investment property kasi alam natin ang nagiging purpose niya in the future. So, if an entity has not determined that it will use the land as owner-occupied property, so, in contrary sa example ko, or for short-term sale in the ordinary course of business, the land is regarded as held for capital appreciation, therefore, classified as investment property. Next, a building owned by the entity or a right-of-use asset relating to a building held by the entity and leased out under one or more operating leases. So, this is the most important part of the example, yung leased out under one or more operating lease. Only in such time na magiging investment property yung right-of-use asset. And finally, a building, meron pa yung kasunod, a building that is vacant but is held to be leased out under one or more operating lease, so almost the same with number 4, bullet number 4. And finally, property that is being constructed or developed for future use as investment property. So, in contrary to bullet number 1, ito, habang kino-construct mo siya, alam mo na yung magiging purpose niya in the future, which is another investment property. Okay. The standard also mentioned other assets which are not to be classified as investment property. So, a property intended for sale in the ordinary course of business or in the process of construction or development for such sale, for example, property acquired exclusively with a view to subsequent disposal in the near future or for development and resale. So, technically, these are to be classified as inventories. Example ay a real estate company purchased a lot and then developed as subdivision for sale. So, inventories yon. Next, owner-occupied property, including, among others, property held for future use as owner-occupied property, property held for future development and subsequent use as owner-occupied property. Ito, importante ito, property occupied by employees, whether or not the employees pay rent at market rates. marami sa atin nag-aakala na if a property is occupied by employees and the employees are paying market rate, it's to be classified as investment property. But no, the standard says it's owner-occupied property. And of course, owner-occupied property awaiting disposal. So those are not investment property. Finally, property that is leased to another party under finance lease. So as I mentioned and clarified earlier, no, if yung sublease is operating lease, that's investment property. If yung sublease is finance lease, or kahit hindi sublease, if the asset being leased out is finance lease, yung lessor kasi doon, hindi na siya magbubuk sa libro niya ng asset. So, walang magiging investment property. Now, there are special considerations discussed ang IAS 40 regarding investment property. Number one dyan, yung tinatawag nating properties with dual purpose. So, some properties comprise a portion that is held to earn rentals or for capital appreciation, and another portion that is held for use in production or supply of goods or services or for administrative purposes. So, say for example, a building, yung ibang floors pinaparentahan, yung ibang floors ginagamit as office. Okay? So, ano ang magiging reporting ng building na yon in the books of the entity? Number one, if these portions could be sold separately or leased out separately under a finance lease, an entity accounts for the portions separately. So, kung kaya mong i-determine separately, kaya mong i-account separately yung sino doon yung for rent and sino doon yung for admin purposes, din yung accounting natin separate din. So, isang building lang, pero pag na-report siya sa FS, ibang accounts, magkaibang accounts. Yung iba, investment property, yung iba, owner-occupied property. Number two, if the portions could not be sold separately, hindi determinable. The property is investment property only if an insignificant portion is held for use in the production or supply of goods or services or for administrative purposes. So dito, titingnan mo sino ang mas significant at sino yung insignificant. Yung classification mo ng significant ang nasusunod. Okay? So, that's the discussion for properties with dual purpose. Okay, next is ancillary services. So, these are services provided for by the entity to the occupants of a specific property. So, the question here is, how do ancillary services affect the classification of the property, whether investment property or owner-occupied property? So, in some cases, an entity provides ancillary services to the occupants of a property it holds. If the services are insignificant to the arrangement as a whole, example is when the owner of an office building provides security and maintenance services to the lessees who occupy the building, then the property is investment property. Typical naman to. May isang building na pinarerentahan at iba't ibang company ang nag-office doon sa building na yon. Siyempre, yung building may security and maintenance service sa mga tenants. Well, ang services doon na tinatawag nating ancillary services nga, they are insignificant to the arrangement as a whole. Therefore, the property is classified as investment property. So, para bang hindi yon ang main consideration ng mga tenants bakit sila nag-rent sa building na yon. Okay? So, yun ang ibig sabihin ng insignificant to the arrangement as a whole. Next, if the services provided are significant to the arrangement as a whole, example, yung hotel. Okay? Di ba? One of the considerations that we think of sa pamimili ng mga hotel na gusto nating puntahan is yung service ng hotel na kayang ibigay sa atin. Kaya nga minsan, di ba, when we book hotels, tinitingnan muna natin yung reviews kasi they are significant to us. In that case, the property is an owner-occupied property, not investment property. Okay? Okay, next is properties between parent and subsidiary. So in some cases, an entity owns property that is leased to and occupied by its parent or another subsidiary. In the separate FS, so sa magkahiwalay na FS ni lessor or ni lessee, the lessor treats the property as investment property in its individual financial statements, whereas in the consolidated financial statements as a group. So, combination or consolidation ng parent and subsidiary. The property is owner-occupied property from the perspective of the group. By the way, consolidated FS is different from combined FS. When we say consolidated FS, it's between the parent and subsidiary as a group. When we say combined FS, walang subsidiary, parent-subsidiary relationship. Say for example, combined FS ang tawag ng pinagsama-samang FS ng lahat ng branch ng BDO. Yan. Let's combine FS kasi yung mga branches na yun, hindi sila parent subsidiary. So, in this particular subtopic, let's have an example. Illustration. Green Cross has a right-of-use building during the year. Green Cross leased out portion of the building to Sunshine, a subsidiary under an operating lease. Question, nasatisfy ba ang requirement ng investment property? Yes. Sino ang lessor? Si Green Cross. Sino yung lessee? Si Sunshine. Ano ang relationship nilang dalawa? Parent subsidiary. So, sino ang magre-report ng investment property? Sa separate FS ni Green Cross, that's investment property. But for purposes of consolidated FS between Green Cross and Sunshine, it's an owner-occupied property. Okay, next is recognition. So when do we recognize an investment property? An owned investment property shall be recognized as an asset when and only when it is probable that the future economic benefits that are associated with the investment property will flow to the entity and the cost of the property can be measured reliably. So technically, the same lang siya with all other assets recognition criteria. But meron lang akong gustong i-emphasize, yung first statement, an owned investment property shall be recognized. Emphasis doon sa word na owned. Bakit kailangan sabihing owned? Kung babalikan natin ang definition ng investment property, it's held by the owner or by the lessee of a right-of-use asset. Kasi nga, if the investment property is recognized through yung second part, lessee as a right-of-use asset, we will not apply IAS 40. We will apply IFRS 16. Kasi yung IFRS 16 leases, it is a transaction standard. Meaning, yung manner ng pag-acquire sa kanya, yun ng leases or lease, gagamitan mo ng IFRS 16. But once na nandun na siya sa libro mo, na-acquire mo na siya, after initial recognition, ika-classify mo na siya kung anong klaseng asset siya. Kung investment property, use IAS 40. Kung PPE, use IAS 16. So, nagets nyo? Ang manner lang ng pag-acquire sa kanya, yun yung lease. Subsequent measurement, pwede na siyang investment property or PPE, depende kung paano mo siya gagamitin sa company. Okay? Initial measurement. So, how much is the investment property? An owned investment property shall be measured initially at its cost plus transaction cost. So, almost the same din. Cost plus transaction cost. But, what is cost? Specific. Sino yung cost? Lagi kong sinasabi, parang tulad nung sa PPE, cost depends on the manner of acquisition. Depende kung paano mo binili or paano mo inacquire si investment property. Number one, most common, purchase. So, purchase price plus directly attributable cost ang nagiging initial measurement natin ng investment property. So, purchase price, binayaran mo doon sa seller and all other costs incurred in relation to bringing the investment property to its present location or condition. Yun yung definition ng directly attributable expenditure. So, directly attributable expenditure includes professional fees, legal services, property taxes, and other transaction costs. Next, what if inutang mo deferred payment yung investment property? So that's cash price equivalent. Kung halimbawa hindi siya inutang, magkano siya? Yun yung cash price equivalent. Now, anong treatment natin dun sa difference ng cash price equivalent tsaka yung total payment? Magkaiba ba sila? Yes, kasi pag sinabi natin cash price equivalent, kung bibilin mo siya ng cash, mas mura siya kaysa sa binili mo siya ng utang. Tama? Yung difference ng nilang dalawa, tawag natin dun ay discount. Okay? At yung discount na yun ay ina-amortize natin yun over the credit term as interest expense. Next, exchange. So, pwede tayong nag-acquire ng investment property through exchange. Generally, kapag exchange, the initial measurement of the asset is the fair value of the asset given up. Unless, so hindi mo gagamitin yung fair value of asset given up if, number one, the transaction lacks commercial substance, walang commercial substance, and number two, the fair value of both the asset given up and the asset received are not reliably measurable. If the acquired asset is not measured at fair value, meaning lacks commercial substance or yung fair value ng dalawa ay not measurable, of course, we will use the carrying amount of the asset given up. Wala tayong choice kasi nga walang fair value of asset given up. Next, right of use assets. Ito yung sinasabi ko kanina. We acquired an asset through lease. So, lessee ka ng right of use asset. The asset shall be measured initially at its cost in accordance with IFRS 16. So, discuss siya sa iba nating lesson when we have IFRS 16 leases. Next, measurement after initial recognition. So, actually, subsequent measurement, nai-encounter lang natin siya if by December 31, nandun pa yung asset. So, ganito na, to simplify, when we say initial recognition, that's the first time na i-incorporate mo yung asset sa libro mo. Pagdating ng December 31, tanungin mo, yung asset ba na binili mo nandun pa? Kasi kung nandun pa, we will have subsequent measurement. Kung wala na, we will not apply the rules for measurement after initial recognition. So for example, bumili ka ng inventory, by December 31, naubos, edi wala kang subsequent measurement. So, for investment property, an entity shall choose as its accounting policy for investment property either the fair value model or the cost model. So, depende kung ano magiging policy ng company to be applied in accounting for its investment property. So, we have two models available, fair value or cost. Basta may condition. And shall apply that policy to all of its investment property, meaning one for all. Fair value for one, fair value for all. Okay? Cost model for one, cost model for all. Pero ano dito yung parang default? Or ano dito yung parang ini-encourage ni standard to be used? Well, since this is an investment account, ang most common na ginagamit is the fair value model. Okay. Now, accounting for investment property using the fair value model. After initial recognition, an entity that chooses the fair value model shall measure all of its investment property at fair value. Now, ano yung kailangan nating tandaan sa fair value model? Number one, estimated disposal costs are ignored. Okay? The name of the model is fair value model, not fair value less cost to sell model. At ano yung kaibahan ng fair value and fair value less cost to sell? The presence of cost to sell or yung estimated disposal cost, estimated cost to sell. So, they are ignored. So, by December 31, hanapin mo lang si fair value at yun yung magiging amount to be used in presenting the asset in the statement of financial position. Next, the investment property under the fair value model is not depreciated. Wala kang depreciation expense. Gain or loss arising from change in the fair value of investment property shall be recognized in profit or loss for the period in which it arises. So dito, change in fair value. So December 31 last year versus December 31 this year, any difference in fair value taken to profit or loss every year. Okay? Walang accumulation. For right-of-use asset held by lessee as investment property, the lessee shall measure the right-of-use asset and not the underlying asset at fair value. Okay, sa IFRS 16, discuss thoroughly ito, no? Right-of-use asset is different from underlying asset, no? And for purposes of IAS 40, fair value model, what is to be measured using the fair value model is the right-of-use asset and not the underlying asset. Okay? Now, what if the fair value is not reliably measurable? So, in exceptional cases that the fair value of the investment property is not reliably measurable on a continuing basis, ibig sabihin hanggang dulo, patuloy na walang fair value, hindi measurable yung fair value. The entity shall measure that investment property using the cost model until disposal. Kasi nga, continuing basis yung not reliably measurable ang fair value. And the residual value of the investment property shall be assumed to be zero for purposes of determining the depreciation. Kasi nga, cost model, dinidepreciate yung asset. Next, if an entity determines that the fair value of an investment property under construction, so separate ito sa nauna, is not reliably measurable, but expects the fair value of the property to be reliably measurable when construction is complete. So habang kino-construct siya, actually parang with sense to, no? Habang kino-construct, wala pa siyang fair value, pero the entity expects na at the point of completion of the self-constructed asset, may fair value na siya. So, paano i-measure? It shall measure the investment property under construction at cost. Cost muna. And then, kung sino yung mauna, kung magiging available na ba yung fair value or makomplete na yung construction, tsaka lilipat sa fair value. So, it shall measure that investment property under construction at cost until either its fair value becomes reliably measurable or construction is completed. Now, sino si cost model? So, after fair value model, we have cost model. After initial recognition, an entity that chooses the cost model shall measure all of its investment property in accordance with ito. Bago yung next discussion. Actually, if an investment property is accounted for using fair value model, we will apply IAS 40. But if the entity applies cost model in accounting for its investment property, the moment na mag-decide yung entity to apply cost model, tapos na si 40. So depart from 40 and use other standards, papasok yung ibang standard, depende kung ano ang mga criteria na mamimit nitong specific asset na to. Okay? So, ito. So, if you decided to account for the asset using the cost model and na-meet ni asset ang criteria ng asset held for sale, we will use IFRS 5. So, meron kang investment property, hindi mo ma-determine yung fair value, tapos ang ginawa mo, gusto mo na lang siyang ibenta, ay apply IFRS 5. Now, what if hindi mo siya gustong ibenta? Pero, right of use asset siya. So in that case, IFRS 16. If it is held by lessee as a right of use asset and it is not held for sale. Na paano kung hindi mo siya gustong ibenta, not held for sale, and hindi naman siya asset held by the lessee as a right of use asset? No choice ka. Use IAS 16. So ito yung, kumbaga, catch basin natin. Cost model, hindi siya asset held for sale, hindi din siya asset, right of use asset held by the lessee, we will apply IAS 16. Okay? Next, transfers of investment property. Ano ibig sabihin ng transfers of investment property? So, change in classification ito, kumbaga. Although, yung ibang standard kasi, say for example, for debt security, when we say reclassification or change in classification, magpapalit siya ng classification, magpapalit ng model, pero within the same standard. Ito, pag nagpalit ng classification, pag nag-transfer ng investment property, we will depart from investment property. Pupunta tayo sa ibang standard. Pero si IAS 40 pa din ang i-apply natin sa point of transfer, sa point of change in classification. An entity shall transfer a property to or from investment property when and only when there is change in use. So, hanggat walang change in use na binabanggit, no, we cannot change the classification or we cannot transfer a property to or from investment property. Of course, kailangan kasing masatisfy mo yung recognition criteria ng asset. So, when can we say that there is change in use? So, commencement of owner occupation or of development with a view to owner occupation for a transfer from investment property to owner occupied property. So, start na ng owner occupation. Dating investment property, ngayon gusto nang i-occupy ng owner. Commencement of development with a view to sale for a transfer from investment property to inventory. Hindi ito basta-basta asset, no? Halimbawa, yung isang ordinary company na hindi naman real estate company, hindi ibig sabihin na may land siya kanina at gusto niya nang ibenta, magiging inventory yung land. No, dapat real estate ka kasi land yung pinag-uusapan. Otherwise, hindi magiging inventory ang transfer. Magiging asset held for sale lang siya, tulad ng minention ko kanina. So, ingat ha sa mga transactions involved. End of owner occupation. So, tapos nang gamitin ng owner for a transfer from OOP to investment property. Dati, ino-occupy ng owner as office. Ngayon, biglang pinarentahan to third parties. That is OOP to IP. And finally, inception of an operating lease to another party for a transfer from inventory to investment property. Dati binibenta mo pero walang gusto bumili. Pinarentahan mo na lang. So, inventory to investment property. Now, transfers at fair value. So, accounting. But, ang specific dito is the investment property is measured at fair value. So, to investment property measured at fair value or from investment property measured at fair value. Although, limited lang naman yung to or from dito OOP lang din do tsaka inventory. Okay, so investment to OOP or inventory or vice versa. Number 1, investment property at fair value to owner-occupied property or inventory. The fair value of the date of change is the deemed cost. So anong nangyayari dito? Magiging OOP or inventory ang dating investment property. So ano lang magiging entry mo dyan? Debit inventory, credit investment property. Walang ibang accounts, wala. Kasi kung ano yung naging fair value ng investment property, bago siya ma-transfer, yun ang i-debit mo na bagong cost ng inventory or OOP man yan. And then yun din yung i-credit mo sa investment property. So walang difference in amounts. Next, owner-occupied property to investment property at fair value. Ito medyo komplikado to. Dati kang OOP, gagawin mo siyang investment property at fair value. The difference between the fair value and the previous carrying amount. So, kanina, ang owner-occupied property mo, measured at carrying amount. And then ngayon, gagawin mo siyang investment property measured at fair value. Ano yung dalawang instances na pwede mangyari? Pwedeng ang fair value is higher or pwedeng ang fair value is lower. So, unahin natin if ang fair value is lower. So, ang pupuntahan niyang investment property mas mababa kaysa sa pinanggalingan niyang amount. The decrease in carrying amounts is either impairment loss or cancellation of revaluation surplus if there is any. So, in effect, para itong accounting ng revaluation decrease ng revalued asset. So, ano magiging entry mo doon? Una, uubusin mo muna, exhaust muna the balance of the revaluation surplus. Pag wala na, tsaka lang mag-debit ang impairment loss. So, ano yung magiging proforma entry? Debit investment property at what amount? At fair value. Credit land at carrying amount. Since mas malaki ang credit kaysa sa debit, kulang ka sa debit na ang pagkukunan mo ay revaluation surplus. Kung walang balanse yan, impairment loss. Baliktarin natin. What if the fair value is higher than the carrying amount. So saan pupunta? Revaluation surplus. Anong proforma entry? Investment property at fair value, credit land at carrying amount, which is lower. So kulang pa si credit. Edi credit ka pa ng revaluation surplus. It's as if in-apply natin si IAS 16. Okay? Next, inventory to investment property at fair value. So dating inventory, gagawin mong investment property at fair value. So the difference between fair value and the previous carrying amount is taken to profit or loss. So debit investment property at fair value, credit inventory, at the cost, yung LCNRV mo. Credit gain kung kulang si inventory, kung mas maliit ang amount ng inventory. Debit loss kung baliktad yung nangyari. Okay? Next, completion of self-constructed investment property at fair value. The difference between the fair value and the previous carrying amount is taken to profit or loss. So same siya sa number 3. PL yung difference in value. So debit ka ng investment property, credit ka ng CIP, construction in progress. Ito yung account na ginamit ko kasi ito yung naisip kong account na ginagamit habang under construction yung asset. And any difference in fair value is credited as gain, profit or loss. Pwede ding loss, depende kung ano yung mas maliit. Next, how do we present an investment property in the statement of financial position? Bakit statement of financial position? Kasi asset siya. So, investment property shall be shown separately as a line item. Mayroon tayong line item mismo sa investment property. According to IAS 1 yan. On the face of the statement of financial position under non-current asset. Okay? Land or building yan eh. So, non-current asset. Final topic, disposal. So, the recognition of an investment property. An investment property shall be recognized on disposal or when the investment property is permanently withdrawn from use and no future economic benefits are expected from its disposal. Ano sabi? Gain or loss is the net proceeds less carrying amount. Sino si net proceeds? It's the selling price less cost to sell. Okay, wag malilito ha. Kanina, minention ko na yung cost to sell ay ini-ignore in subsequent measurement of the investment property. By December 31, wag mong ibabawas ang cost to sell doon sa fair value for purposes of subsequent measurement. Pag nireport mo yung investment property sa balance sheet mo, huwag mong ibawas yung cost to sell. Pero ngayon kasi binenta mo na siya. So yung debit to cash mo nung binenta mo sa investment property is net na yung cost to sell mo. So net disposal proceeds less the carrying amount is your gain or loss. And the gain or loss is taken to profit or loss. Compensation from third parties for investment property that was impaired, lost, or given up shall be recognized in profit or loss when the compensation becomes receivable. Actually, ano to? IAS 37. So, hanggat hindi siya nare-receive or nagiging receivable, the compensation from third parties is not recognized. Ha? And then, it is recognized in profit or loss, meaning income yan. So, debit ka ng receivable, credit ka ng income. Okay? Okay, that's all. Thank you. Don't forget to like, to subscribe, and hit the notification bell.